The field of IR was founded on key assumptions about the centrality of the sovereign state system in determining how the world works. As your book identifies, though, it is one thing to describe the state structure in the modern period and quite another to say that this is the only way things can be or that the way things should be. The privileging of the sovereign state and the state system has been vigorously defended by sovereign states, and a study of institutions tells us that institutions develop their own incentives to stay in existence that may not have anything to do with their necessity or fit with modern circumstances. That's the very idea behind institutional inertia. As a result, they tend to perpetuate their own existence through rules, processes, and patterns of behavior. And after all, what is the state if not an institution or a collection of institutions, to be more accurate? For policymakers who have tended to have pretty short time horizons, the perpetuation of the state system is essential to their continued relevance in the system. Thus, a lot of the literature on globalization looks at different ways that states cope with this new challenge to their sovereignty. So the state and state sovereignty has been central to the study of international relations. Combining all of the affected institutions and actors within them, it is difficult to imagine another type of scenario where a structure other than states dominate. But there are challenges in scholarship as well as in the real world to state organizations. Some critics of states would like to see globalization work to erode the power of states, while some others say that this has already happened. Still others argue that the state should not be replaced but transformed through the process of globalization. Each of these perspectives is concerned with practical as well as normative challenges associated with governing. The assignment of administrative responsibilities without the state, for example, is an intimidating concept, but the reality of states using control over the monopoly of violence to oppress or deprive their own people is also a concern from the normative side. The concept of globalization is difficult to define. It is easier to narrow down a set of common themes that scholars of globalization focus on. For example, they discuss the compression of time and space, the increased interconnectivity of human groups, the increased volume of the exchange of commodities, people, and ideas, and finally, the emergence of various forms of global consciousness, which we might simply call cosmopolitanism. In broad social terms, globalization has been conceptualized as a process whereby the population of the world is increasingly bonded into a single society. This is suggestive of globalization as a historical force propelling the world towards a very different future from that of its fragmented past. In cultural terms, globalization is often thought to be producing a singular, homogenized version of modernity, albeit one based on a dominant Western pattern to which others will eventually conform. Politically, globalization may be understood as referring not only to the increasing enmeshment of people within the networks of global governance, but also to the spread of more widely shared political values around the world. Geographically, the homogenizing forces of globalization mean that boundaries break down, distances shrink, and places lose significance. Economically, globalization is often seen to be at its most dynamic, especially since the collapse of communism and the ascendancy of neoliberal ideas. In this sense, globalization may be seen to represent the triumph of capitalism, and according to some, globalization simply represents a more unified capitalistic economic system. Given that capitalism also embodies certain social, cultural, and political values, however, the economic dimension is inseparable from the other ones. Indeed, the social, the cultural, the political, the geographic, and the economic are all intertwined phenomena. Most historians agree that there have been four major waves of globalization throughout the modern world system. For the first period, from around the mid-18th century to the 1870s, we see a phase of incipient globalization, which includes the increasing formalization of international relations through the consolidation of sovereign states and a state system, primarily in Europe and North America, the invention of international humanitarian regimes like the 1840 World Anti-Slavery Convention, the invention of international non-governmental organizations like the Red Cross in 1863. The second phase, from the end of the 1870s through the 1920s, includes the establishment of world time, the creation of global forms of communication and travel, and also the First World War. A third phase from the 1920s to the 1960s saw, among other things, the formal entanglement of virtually the entire non-Western world in the web of globalization, the establishment of the League of Nations, followed by the more inclusive United Nations and its many agencies after the Second World War, the relative decline of Britain and the rise of the U.S., the effective globalization of the Cold War and its conflict over conceptions of modernity and world order, decolonization, and the rise of the third world voice in international affairs. The final phase runs from the 1960s to the present and is obviously ongoing. It has mostly been involved due to greatly accelerated expansion of global communications, especially via electronic technology. This includes the launching of the first communications satellite, as well as first broadcasts using satellites. This period also sees a growing global influence of financial institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF, especially in terms of promoting market-oriented economic principles and also increasing countries' debt. The instrumental view of the state highlights areas over which states and their national governments are allegedly losing control. As Castells comments, the instrumental capacity of the nation-state is decisively undermined by the globalization of core economic activities, by the globalization of media and electronic communication, by the globalization of crime, by the globalization of social protest, and by the globalization of insurgency in the form of transborder terrorism. This idea of globalization, however, has been celebrated when it comes to economics by neoliberal supporters. They believe that the markets know best and should be allowed to follow their natural path. This view has been given prominence in the post-Cold War era. This view has also given birth to an anti-political form of neoliberalism, which sees capitalism as liberating the global economy from the control of the state and therefore of politics. In this vision, the state of the future will have little else to do except protect the market system by maintaining law and order and upholding rights of private property. Objections to this rather extreme form of liberalism come from the political left and right. Both sides see dangers in reducing the scope of political life to marginal adjustments in the management of market institutions and closing off the political process to questions about the market itself. Politics is seen as necessary to question the consequences of globalization, but also to defend society where necessary against the negative impact of market forces. While this seems like an odd instance of agreement between these two, keep in mind that both share a normative commitment to communitarianism, although they express it in different ways. And they believe that the community is more important than economic universalism and individualism. Both classic conservatives and democratic socialists are unlikely to see globalization as a positive development because they see the state as giving the community shape and substance. For the democratic socialists, as well as for liberals with a commitment to social issues, the state also provides a mechanism for the distribution of public goods and services that would not be provided privately. According to one commentator, this has been the case since 1945, when the normative framework of human rights embedded a sense of obligation on the part of the state towards its citizens, an obligation made more difficult by economic integration and the extent to which market forces now seem to dictate policy choices in governments. This is almost certainly a major factor in the rise of anti-politics among ordinary people. In Britain, for example, the rise of the UKIP party has been attributed directly to a surge of anti-political sentiment among voters. Similar points have been made about the Trump phenomenon in the U.S., where Donald Trump is seen by supporters and detractors alike as taking a stand against politics as usual. This anti-globalist view is somewhat contradicted by reality in the globalized world. For example, the U.S. has taken the lead in globalization, and other strong states have done so as well. And this means that states have been the drivers of globalization. Another reality lies in the fact that states still hold the majority of power over domestic politics in practice. And since they are the major drivers of globalization, you could more or less view them as the architects of globalization instead of the victims of it. And yet, a very different view from both of these perspectives is one that sees state transformation under the post-World War II conditions as more or less creating a Western bloc that develops something like a Western state, a massive, institutionally complex, and messy conglomeration of state power that is centered in North America, Western Europe, Japan, and Australia. Further, with the collapse of the Western Bloc, the Western state is the only global center and has been able to utilize legitimate global institutions, especially the United Nations, to underwrite its global projection of power. The main point of these contrary findings is to illustrate that perhaps the state is not losing as much power as globalization or globalist or anti-globalist would have people believe. There are three distinct approaches to the question of the relationship between culture and globalization, each operating under a different assumption. First, there are those who assume that under the present conditions of globalization, the dominant economic paradigm of global capitalism creates a version of cultural globalization in its own image. A second approach rejects this and views the prevalence of nationalism and ethnic politics as evidence of resistance to globalizing forces, both economic and cultural, and one could possibly add political as well. Third, there is a perspective which repudiates both of these, promoting instead an approach that sees transnational cultural forms emerging, but these are not dominated by the logic of global capitalism. Modernity is often assumed to entail westernization in one way or another. The latter is sometimes posited as a necessary condition, even, for modernity. But is it? Much depends on how modernity is conceptualized. The discussion in Chapter 1 linked modernity quite explicitly with a complex of scientific, political, and social developments in Europe and North America. Developments in science and technology brought about industrialization and expanded forms of urbanization, which in turn impacted communities and their particular lifestyles. The rise of the sovereign state system was another significant development, but by itself did not necessarily bring about modern politics. This was affected more through the rise of emancipatory ideas which rejected many aspects of traditional or religious authority, embraced a democratic agenda of political reform and national politics, and promoted universalist notions of humanity. Western modernity is usually taken to include this entire package. The question, therefore, arises as to whether it is possible to dispense with some elements. For example, is it possible to have modernity without a liberal social and political order? In short, a liberal culture. The government of Singapore, for example, rules over one of its most modern phases in Asia and seems to have achieved this goal. It is the only country in its region to modernize without liberalizing, an achievement that China is keen to emulate. Germany and Japan before the Second World War were authoritarian but also modern in the sense that they had advanced industrialized economic bases. The French postmodern philosopher Michel Foucault is well known for his assertion that the Holocaust was a product of modernity. Today, there are elements in many countries outside the West that want modernity in the technical, scientific, and industrial sense, but without any liberal, social, and political elements. And they certainly do not want to become replicas of the United States. Thus, the desire for modernization is often qualified by a rejection of certain political and social values perceived as undesirable. However, it is not beyond the bounds of possibility for countries to embrace liberal political and social institutions as well as industrialization without becoming clones of the U.S. or any other Western country. The cosmopolitan approach to normative international theory in some ways seems amenable to globalization, especially in the sense that it could bring humanity closer together through softening political and other boundaries. But cosmopolitans have been especially critical of the extent to which the doctrine of state sovereignty, which guides globalization, and has an emphasis on non-intervention in the internal affairs of other states, has been used as a shield behind which some states perpetuate gross human rights violations. They have also been critical of the notion that morality depends on culture and that universalist human rights and other goods is not included in this idea. Cosmopolitans do see value in community in sense of identity, but they do not see this as a reason to defend state sovereignty, especially when it shields states from accountability for crimes against humanity. The cosmopolitan view also supports global distributive justice on the grounds that we all share an intrinsic human quality. However, communitarians generally defend boundaries as an essential aspect of human existence, especially those that reflect cultural divisions and provide a central framework for community living, identity, and values. One of the more relevant questions that comes up when thinking about normative theory and the state in the context of globalization is the notion of responsibility and how far responsibility of states extends, how far responsibility of individuals extends. Also, to what extent both the global and the local, the universal and the particular, are interdependent. One of the major areas where these notions converge is the environment. Policymakers, as well as citizens, have asked the question, who bears the responsibility for clean air, clean water today, much less for future generations? Another area of concern is refugees fleeing from conflict or natural disasters, or even those who are simply unable to eke out a basic living in their homelands. The question is what type of ethic, communitarianism or cosmopolitanism, should be applied to problems such as these. And with the phenomenon of nationalism, seen as important for some contexts for creating states as well as presenting challenges to their survival, how do we envision a cosmopolitan political community where equality for people in other distant places is a priority? How can we achieve such a feat when the question of nationalism and other cultures in our own homelands creates such incredible tension? Indeed, this is the topic that the two articles selected for your discussion assignment this week are meant to address. In a globalizing world, increased immigration is inevitable, and with it, we have seen a rise in far-right nationalism, a form of communitarianism that seeks to preserve, in some cases, racial purity of its states. Your task is to evaluate arguments from two different sides of this question. While Haight is sympathetic to nationalists and less sympathetic to cosmopolitans, Calhoun lays out the elements of cosmopolitanism and nationalism in a much different way. So your job is essentially to compare these two pieces to one another and make the case for one or the other's perspective in viewing and treating this problem of immigration and right-wing nationalism.